Peter Metcalfe, and many of you, if I haven't met you already, are aware of the emails I've sent out, quite a few of them leading up to this event. Thankfully, we have Jerry here to do a little introduction.
Thank you, Peter. I just wanted to say a couple of words in introduction to Peter. Is Kathy going to present too? And Kathy. One of the things that Brother Andy had really wanted to do is write. Writing was one of his passions, and one of the reasons why is because I know that when I was barely a teenager, he was really interested in getting things that were of our culture and of our people into the mainstream education system. He found it a challenge to do that, to get hooked into publishers, to get hooked into anybody who is interested into getting things of our culture into the education, mainstream education system. For example, he thought it was really interesting that they would teach in writing Japanese and Spanish language, French language. And one time when I was a sophomore in high school, he said, come on with me, I'm going to go to talk to your superintendent. And what he wanted to do was ask the superintendent if they could teach Tlingit in the Sitka School District, in the Sitka High School. Broshot was our superintendent at the time, or actually he's the principal at Sitka High School. And Mr. Broshot said, Larry, your mom wants you. So Principal Broshot's response was, yeah, you can have Tlingit language taught in Sitka High School as long as you have someone who has a master's in Tlingit language. And there's so many different ways to say no. And I thought that that was an interesting way to make sure that it was no, that you could not teach Tlingit language at that time. And that was 1971. We're not going to do any math here to figure out my age. But you know, one of the things that he really thought was interesting too is Greek mythology was taught in the schools. Why not Tlingit mythology? And what about the story of the Alaska Native Brotherhood? What about the story of Alaska Native Sisterhood? Isn't that important to get published, to get printed, to get into the mainstream education system? And one of the things that he did, and I think it was brought up by Kim Metcalfe earlier, is the history of the relationship between the Metcalfe family and the Hope family, from Andrew Hope to John Hope, Vern Metcalfe, and on down through our generations. But Andy and Peter were famous friends for quite a while. Interestingly enough, Peter got looped into a real interest of his, and that's publishing. Before Andy passed away, he and Peter had come up with the idea of the 50 year of statehood. And what was the role of Alaska Natives in the statehood for Alaska? And they were successful in getting a grant. That was one of the last publishing efforts that Brother Andy had worked on, and that was with Peter and with Kathy. And so it's with a great pleasure and pride to be able to listen to Peter and Kathy this afternoon on what they came up with in the publishing of one of Andy's last efforts in publication. Please help me welcome Peter Metcalfe.
Thank you, Jerry. You know, the other day I was standing in line waiting to get some coffee at the bookstore where there's a coffee shop, and there's a post right near where you wait for your coffee, and there's, I recommend you take a look at it. It's pretty humorous. There's a newspaper clipping with a list of outrageous metaphors that college professors from across the country had submitted from papers they had been reviewing, I guess, from students. And one was, he fell for her like a mob informant into the East River. The one that seemed appropriate here was, it's a simple plan like Uncle Phil, but unlike Uncle Phil, it may just work. And that's what, you know, myself and I know Kathy and Ishmael, all of whom were involved in the planning of this event, and all of us had to kind of assemble our presentation at the very last minute. I know Ishmael sent both Kathy and I a transcript of what he was working on, and it was like at 12:45 last night. And it's a very good presentation, so please stand by for that. The nature of this slide that we have up is just an inspiration I got when I realized what we really did as a result of this project, which was based on the Alaska Statehood Experience Program, and we were, as Jerry mentioned, investigating what the role of Alaska Natives was during the statehood movement, which was roughly 1945 to the late 1950s. And what I believe we accomplished was to bring back a very important element of that story and the role of Alaska Natives in the statehood movement. In a sense, it was repatriating the story because it's been largely lost. And that is the very significant impact that the Alaska Native Brotherhood had during the statehood movement. Part of our inspiration came from, I was reading Willie Hensley's book, and I don't want to get the impression that I'm slamming his book, but it was just this one paragraph that brought me up short. And as with any book that I read, if I come to a point where I find something that's not factually correct, I have trouble completing the book. And in this case, he was making a statement about when he first arrived in the Alaska legislature in 1964 as a newly elected Inupiat legislator. And you know, I was fairly young then, but it was, you know, later in the 60s I came of age, and you know, I remember that time, a period of a lot of change and energy, and you know, we were all full of ourselves, and certainly Willie and the other young legislators who were elected at that time were so too. But Willie's observation that nothing had been done just in terms of land rights and Alaska Native rights, just, you know, I knew that was wrong. But as with a lot of things, it's hard to prove, you know, what you know. So you got to dig in and get into the archives and prove it. And fortunately, because of a grant we received, as Jerry mentioned, it was Andy's idea. Well, I think Kathy actually alerted us, and we ended up down in this hall, in the A&B hall in downtown Juneau, for a presentation by the Alaska Humanities Forum, encouraging us to encouraging anyone who was listening to encourage a grant, submit a grant. And so we pursued this course, which was to determine the role of Alaska Natives generally in the statehood movement. And we received that grant in June of 2008. And unfortunately, Andy passed away 6 weeks later, so it fell to Kathy and I and our team to complete this grant. And it took us a little while to get underway, but once we did, we really got into it and ended up producing this essay that's available up front. And we called it The Sword and the Shield, and this was inspiration by Kathy, who's an attorney, and when she was being educated as an attorney, she explained to me this theory about swords and shields in terms of the law, and that the law can be used to carve out new rights or principles, and shields can be deployed as a shield to prevent something from happening. And we realized that fit really with what we were finding out in our research. So prior to statehood, as has been explained in Professor Haycox's presentation and Sergey and my sister's presentation earlier today, the Alaska Native Brotherhood carved out the rights by which Alaska Native became fully invested citizens of Alaska, and that was pretty exciting stuff, because they were really making progress, and it was something I'm proud of as a born and raised Alaskan, that it happened in Alaska, that 20 years in advance of the national civil rights movement, Alaska Natives were winning their full citizenship, and it was under their own initiative. So it's something we should all be proud of, and something that should be taught in the schools, because I went through 8 grades of grade school and then high school, and Alaska Native history wasn't really a part of the program in those days. So what we concentrated on was the post-war statehood movement. There was some statehood activity prior to the war, but it really caught fire after the war, and so this is when we discovered the extent to which Alaska Native Brotherhood truly impacted the future history of Alaska, and it was by shielding the efforts to extinguish Alaska Native claims, because by this time, as I'll explain in a little more detail, it dawned on the advocates of statehood that to get there, they needed to deal with Alaska Native claims, and it was really an amorphous concept, and as much as the really strong advocates of statehood may have wished, it wasn't something they could just ignore, because there was a legal basis for these claims. But that legal basis was established by the Alaska Native Brotherhood. And so I came to think of what they were doing, and what's really important to consider is that they were the agency by which, they had the agency, they were the motive force by which Alaska Native claims were recognized and established. They had a lot of help. There was a number of people on the national scene and organizations that were helping Alaska Natives, but without the Alaska Native Brotherhood, there would have been no Alaska Native organized group of Alaska Natives to represent. And in the case of the A&B and the ANS, they were actually funding and providing the not only the money for people to go to Washington, D.C. and lobby, but also people who were actively representing them there, and most importantly, providing the strategy and the foundation for the effort to secure Alaska Native claims. So from this standpoint, from the sword and the shield concept, initially they won the right to vote, the Alaska Native Brotherhood, and largely, William Paul was a towering figure during this time, but as Ishmael is going to present, there were other people who were very active and deserve a lot of credit. And with William Paul, one of the things I learned studying his papers was you could almost call it the tyranny of records or the tyranny of archives, because the guy was incredible. I mean, the amount of letters and correspondence and files he kept was just voluminous, and he kept not only his own letters, which I was wondering why it was so hard to read some of these, onion skin carbons, and it turned out, as he explained in a letter, he said, you have to use at least 7 carbons, because it was pre-copying days, right? And so he was sending out the copies of his letters to other people, and then he was getting copies that way as well. And he would collect letters that were quite obviously sent to him by other people that were critical of him, but he kept those letters. And and so there's this huge record, and as a consequence, you know, William Paul is somebody that we can not at all ignore, nor should we, but there are other people who are involved in all these things. And Ishmael is going to give you one example, and I just, hopefully that if there's any young people or anybody interested in history in this audience, that you'll realize there's a lot here to study and follow up on. But these were the rights that the Alaska Native Brotherhood won, and those were all kind of exciting. You know, they started with a goal and they achieved it, and there was, like, you know, the signing ceremony for the Anti-Discrimination Act and that sort of thing. They accomplished goals, and that's kind of easy to appreciate and write about because, you know, there was a beginning and there was an end. But perhaps what's less dramatic is when they stop something, and just by the nature of logic as we understand it, it's very hard to prove that this was the only thing that stopped something. But in the case of the Alaska Native claims, Aboriginal rights, we're, you know, I think between Kathy and I, and you can judge for yourself by reading this essay we wrote, it's close to undeniable that without the Alaska Native Brotherhood, those rights would have been largely extinguished or settled prior to statehood, and as a consequence, there would have been no Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And I was very happy to hear Professor Haycox talk about that, because when you talk about the ANCSA, sometimes you almost have to apologize, because what it resulted in was all these corporations. But that's kind of the, you know, what happens when you deal with the past and you apply present values, because now we think of corporations as multinational, as, you know, the globalization, and, you know, despite what Romney might say, most of us believe corporations to be faceless and not about people. But in fact, back in 1970, you know, I can remember well enough then that that was a kind of a symbol of progress, and corporations weren't looked at so negatively. And yeah, that was the basis for the ANCSA. And, you know, another kind of present-day value that's applied to that is that this was a solution that was forced upon the Native people. But the more you study Alaska Native history back in those days, the more you realize that, you know, there were other options. They could have pursued the reservation model, and that was open to them. In fact, there were some reservations that were established, and superficial look at it, you wonder, well, why the hell did they not, you know, really pursue that? Because they had that opportunity. They were largely established, but villages like Heidelberg actually voted down the establishment of a reservation. But again, if you look at what was really happening in those days, post-World War II, you realize that, well, for one thing, one of the outstanding features of the Alaska Native Brotherhood from the beginning was that they absolutely refused to be condescended to. And under no circumstances, I mean, they would give up a hell of a lot to not come under the thumb of the Alaska Bureau, Alaska Indian Bureau, as it was called then. It became the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But they would turn down an opportunity if it meant that they had to submit to the supervision of another federal agency. They had an opportunity to claim a bunch of Tongass forest land, but when they found out it was to be administered by the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Forest Service, it stopped right there. And one of the problems with the reservation concept, which was, you know, a subject of its debate, it didn't seem, from what I could glean from the records, as being a real bitter debate, but within the A and B, there were, you know, the opposition, which was embodied by William Paul, and then there were other people like Frank Johnson who were saying, yeah, but, you know, we'd own the land and we'd be able to hunt and fish. But the thing that was really working against them was, you know, like these phrases that can kill a project, like the bridge to nowhere or death panels. In this case, it was like concentration camp. People were thinking, we're going to be forced to live on these reservations, and we'll have, all these rights we've won as to be able to vote and so on. We'd be like in a concentration camp. And that pretty well killed the idea from the basis of the non-political natives. They simply did not want to go, as they would think, backward into a reservation system. So for a very complex reason that came to naught. But so among the things that the Alaska Native Brotherhood achieved in the post-war era was they established the basis of Aboriginal title, the legal basis, and it was very ambiguous up until that time. They gave credence to the Alaska Native reserves, and as I explained, it was kind of an ongoing debate, but at the same time, the threat of establishing reservations in the Tongass National Forest really brought that whole issue of who owned what up to the national level, and it was being debated in Congress as a result of the Alaska Native Brotherhood pursuing reservations. And they challenged the ownership of resources. There was, the pulp companies came in, and the U.S. Forest Service was about to sell a bunch of Tongass timber to get these pulp mills established. And again, they came up with the realization, well, the Tlinkits may actually have a legal ownership basis. So they set aside the money they received in the sales for later possible distribution to Alaska Natives. And that again brought that issue to the surface. And what I mean by adroitly countered statehood ambitions, it was like this was the A and B at their most nuanced and high concept politics. They never opposed statehood, but they made it very clear to the leading proponents of statehood that they weren't going to support it if it meant giving up some of their options. And so the only two statewide leaders at the time were the Bob Bartlett, who was an elected delegate to Congress, non-voting at the time, and Ernest Greening, who was not an elected official. He was an appointed official, governor of Alaska, but nonetheless he was generally considered to represent the whole territory. And they were very much aware that the Alaska Native Brotherhood support was conditional, and so they definitely responded to that, and there's some interesting exchanges that we found that are in our little essay here. And most importantly, the Alaska Native Brotherhood effectively blocked extinguishment legislation, and as you can read, it was a near-run thing. And again, the whole shield concept, did they really stop it, or was that something else? Well, the fact is, unless the Alaska Native Brotherhood was in the game, it was going to happen. It was going to get extinguished. But they were there on the court playing the game. And yeah, there was a little bit of luck involved, but unless you're playing the game, you're not going to be the benefit of a missed pass. And that's kind of what happened with the extinguishment legislation. It was a very, very close thing. But if it had happened, there would have been no Willie Hensley talking about how we came in and nothing had been done and then we accomplished all these goals, because there would have been nothing to accomplish. The Alaska Native claims would have been either extinguished or settled at a very modest settlement. So they set the stage for ANCSA. Now, I want to give credit to our team, and Dick and Nora Downhauer were definitely a part of it. Dick is, as he is for this this whole project, he's been, the treasurer of our project, and he was Tlingit Readers, which Dick and Nora are a big part of, were the recipient of our grant. And then Professor Stephen Langdon was one of our key advisors, and some of the things he educated on us is very clearly a part of our essay. And this is a list of the people who also contributed. And the critical readers were, we gave them the rough draft, and they came back with suggestions and, factual misstatements, and we were able to correct those rather than embarrassing ourselves and having to republish this at a later point. And Donald Craig Mitchell, who many of you may know, he produced two of the landmark books on the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Somewhat of a controversial figure, but I'll give him credit. He tore this thing apart, and I didn't agree with all his criticisms, but some were spot on, and it really made it for. I mean, I really appreciate it when people do actually read something I've written and critique it. It's even though sometimes especially with, if you know Don Mitchell, it's like you subject yourself to some pretty harsh criticism, but it was all good. And Ben Paul, who's going to be up here, he was a critical part of this. He gave us access to his family records. His aunt, the daughter of William Paul Sr., Frances Desgermain, she too gave us access to records and subjected herself to interviews. Zach Jones of the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, Jim Simard, who's here with us, he's been very, very helpful in all the projects I've been working on in the last few years. And Liz Dodd, without Liz, she's our editor, my editor, and she keeps me spot on with the serial commas and other possible typos, so I really appreciate Liz's contributions. But mostly it's due to Andy Hope. We're trying to carry on his legacy, and certainly this project was the main part of what Andy was trying to accomplish, which was really to recover the story and put it out there so that the younger people can have access to this information and carry on with it. And it's through Andy that I got involved in this clan conference to begin with back in 1993, and I owe a lot to this guy, and but we wouldn't have had this project without support from the Alaska Humanities Forum. We submitted the grant and was informed later that it was cut by half, as was I think almost all the grants got a reduction. And as with all these things, you're just kind of doing a glass ball thing. I think we can do it. This is what we think we need, but well, they say how much money you're going to get, and then you retool and you go out and do it. And so, without this grant, which was basically funded by the Rasmussen Foundation, and without the help of the Alaska Humanities Forum through the Alaska Statehood Experience Program, we would not have a project to report on. And I want to thank especially Laura Shue, who's out in the audience. Laura, why don't you stand up for a moment? There she is. You have grant-worthy projects she wants to talk to you, and I got to say, Laura's been the easiest person that I've ever worked with on a grant, and I've worked on a lot of grants, and it can be fairly annoying to be trying to do a project and do what you do well, and then have to force to do what you don't do well, which in my case is keeping track of all the dollars and cents and making everything balance, because in the end, with almost all grants, you're putting in more than you're getting, and then having to do the counting your pennies at the end. That's the not fun part. But the fun part of this for me really was working with Kathy Ruddy, because she has a legal mind, and we were dealing with some very difficult legal concepts, and this grant gave us the opportunity to just literally sit across the table from each other and brainstorm and go back and forth and figure out what we were really trying to accomplish here. And I think for both of us it was a highly rewarding experience, certainly for me. So at this point I would like to bring Kathy Ruddy up, and she will talk about two of the key pieces of legislation that very much influenced the course of Alaska history, the Teton case and the Tlingit-Haida versus United States lawsuit. Kathy?
Okay.
Let's see here. know if we can do this exactly, but view.
Give it a try.
Well, we'll just have to leave it at.
Will it stop there?
Yeah.
Thanks for your patience. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. It's equally a joy to work with Peter. He's an extraordinary researcher and an excellent writer. And I have two thanks, really, at the very beginning. And one is to Andy Hope, who was the inspiration for the work that we did. And the second is to the Rasmussen Foundation through the Humanities Forum. When I heard that the Rasmussen Foundation, in its great wisdom and far vision, had invested $1 million in the Humanities Forum to be distributed throughout the state for a rethinking of statehood 50 years, which of course is unique in that we have so many people who are alive now, one of them being Cyril George, who were young people at the time of statehood. And what worried me at the time, am I too close? Okay. What worried me at the time was that this $1 million would be distributed in Anchorage and north. And so I made a point to invite Greg Kimura to come to Southeast and introduced him to 5 or 6 groups who I thought were worthy of being considered for these, for this investment. This is an investment in the intellectual power of the people of Alaska, and so it became important to me that this monies be distributed in Southeast as well. And there, as I said, there were 4 or 5 groups that I connected them with, and one of them was the Alaska Native Brotherhood, where Andy and Peter happened to be, and also, if any of you know that Andy was a huge fan of Jim Pepper, and Jim Pepper's uncle, who now is the head of the museum, the big museum in Anchorage, just happened to be there at the same time. So it was a lovely convergence of people focused on, this investment in what Andy had done as a vision, which was that the significance of the work of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, it can't be underestimated. In many ways, this is a hidden history. It hasn't been told that the Brotherhood, with its major leaders, William Paul, Andrew Hope, Frank Johnson, the Paratroviches, prevented the extinguishment of Aboriginal title. It was very close. It's like a secret history, and it was a joy to work with Peter on really uncovering this. And I hope that you'll take a look at the essay, The Sword and the Shield, that, as I said, was produced with the assistance of the Rasmussen and the Humanities Forum. And go ahead, sorry. Thank you. It's available online, either through the Humanities Forum website. It's called Door 15. Just go to, search for sword. Or it's also available through the ANKN, Alaska Native Knowledge Network, and you just go to the Tlingit section and look for Sword and Shield. So there's 2 places, or you can purchase it here or through Capital Copy. They're selling it at their cost of $9. And it does contain a chronology so that it's easy to telescope the time. So in the few minutes that I have, what I would like to do is give a nutshell of the 2 important legal cases that constitute the response of the American judicial system to what happened here. I hope this photo is familiar to everyone. This is a hugely significant photo in American history, and that is 1929, the Alaska Native Brotherhood Grand Camp Convention in Haines. And the issue was, should the Tlingit and Haida people sue the U.S. government or not? And of course, the issues, as Peter was describing, were should the government be petitioned to accept a lawsuit? Because as Judge Wickersham had been telling William Paul, in order to sue the government, you needed to get the government's permission to be sued. It's kind of a sovereign thing. And should the A and B, 5 years after citizenship was recognized in the American Native people, when Cyril George was born, he was not a U.S. citizen. He was born in 1922. He was not a citizen. John Hope, he was born, I believe, in 1923. He was not a citizen. It was only at the Citizenship Act that William Paul and the Brotherhood also worked on that Native citizenship was recognized. So this is only 5 years later. Should the A and B vote to file suit against the government to recoup or reclaim or get recompense for lands that had been taken when President Roosevelt conscripted the lands through the Tongass National Forest, I think 1905, and then Glacier Bay 1912. With a stroke of the pen, those lands had been seized. And should there be a lawsuit to ask for recompense? And it was a major issue because many people felt, well, if you ask for the special privilege and you also just want to be an American citizen, you're trying to have your cake and eat it too in some way. You know, these are fascinating discussions that went on. But at this convention, the vote was yes to sue for compensation for the lands. In my research, I didn't find too much about asking for lands back. This is compensation. So what I've got 2 cases to try to tell you about in just a couple of minutes. And the first one is the Tlingit and Haida Indians of America versus the United States. And that is the case that from start to finish was 39 exciting years. 39 years. This is the American judicial response to this major lawsuit. 1929, the Brotherhood voted to bring suit. 1935, between Judge Wickersham and William Paul and others, the Jurisdictional Act was passed permitting the Tlingit and Haida Indians to sue the United States. 1947, the lawsuit was actually brought. And 1959, right after statehood, within a couple of months of the time that President Eisenhower signed us in as the 50th state, the Court of Claims, and this is a special court, this is not the normal federal system, the Court of Claims is specifically designed to handle this kind of compensation claim. 1959, just after statehood, the court held that the Tlingit and Haida Indians have owned Southeast Alaska since time immemorial. A very powerful phrase, and I was talking about it with Diane Purvis, who's just written a book about Tehatan that I'm so eager to read. Since time immemorial, and she said she and Wally Olson have been going round about this. Wally is saying, well, it just means since before anybody had a memory of anything. But since time immemorial is an important phrase that the court used, it validated the actual ownershipness, that's not such a good word, the actual ownership of these Indian people in the land. So that was right after statehood, 1959. Then another 9 years before the same court, this lawsuit I'm telling you about started and ended in the Court of Claims. It never got to the U.S. Supreme Court. 1968, 9 years after the first decision, and that came down with, well, how much are the Tlingit and Haida Indians of Alaska owed? 1959, land was taken, and 1968, the decision was $7.2 million. It was only 1.9, well, I'm not sure how much an acre exactly. The whole statehood was a little bit different, but it was a victory in the fact of having a declaration that the land had been taken. But it was not a victory in terms of the monetary settlement, because it set the amount of value of the land back in 1905. And I've got to go back and read. After talking with Diane Purvis, I'm forgetting, how did they get around paying interest on that amount? I mean, in the American judicial system, if you're recompensing someone for something that happened many years ago, well, you put them in the same position. You give them the interest on the amount. But there was no interest in this decision. However, as Andrew Hope said, Ish's great-grandfather, in the greatest country in the world, in the highest court, well, it was the Court of Claims, we won our case. And that $7.2 million was accepted, and it was invested, and the Tlingit and Haida Central Council now has distributed and maintained and grew because of that. And with that money, $100,000 went to the Alaska Federation of Natives, so that the whole issue of Alaska Native settlement could occur. Without these cases, there wouldn't have been anything to settle at ANCSA. You know, if you got Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, you have to have something to settle. But without this Tlingit and Haida lawsuit and the Tehiton case that I'm about to tell you, there would not have been anything left to settle. This organization that I know many of you are members of and are very proud of, the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood, without this organization and these achievements, there would not have been anything to settle at the time of ANCSA. So I appreciate Peter making the correction to Willie Hensley in his book too. And I did read the whole book. I kept on going, and it's a fascinating book, and it's a very, very good book, and I encourage you all to read it 50 years from tomorrow. But there is that significant error in there. So that's the Tlingit and Haida land claims, land suit in a nutshell, those exciting 39 years. And I start with that case, and then I want to tell you about Tehiton, because Tehiton is almost the sandwich. It's like the meat in the middle of the land suit, the land suit being the bread. 39 years is a long time. Well, Tehiton came in the middle, and in many ways it was a much more important case. And it was brought by William Paul with the assistance of his two sons on behalf of the Tehiton clan, which was his as a matrilineal clan. And the legal theory I will try to summarize for you so that you will be inspired to look for yourself and ask other people. There are many people alive today who know and care and were present at this case and can interpret it much better than I can, particularly Diane Purvis sitting there in the back. She's the one who has analyzed this and is utterly fascinating to me. She just told me that the transcripts of the Tehiton case have just been published. They're on Amazon. You know, I've already ordered up my copy. The theory of the Tehiton case was that the clan, which in Tlingit law did ownership rights rested with the clan, and the theory was that the clan had been wronged when the land was taken away, and William Paul's theory that because natives were citizens, he had an unusual reading of the 14th Amendment that the U.S. court did not accept, but his theory was that under the 5th and 14th Amendments, that equal protection and due process required that if you take something away from a citizen, you need to recompense, you need to pay them back. The first decision came out in the Court of Claims 1954, and then it was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and this is the only one of these cases that got to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was decided by Justice Stanley Reed, who Diane Purvis can tell you a whole lot more about his background. But the nutshell version of this case was, now let me read you one paragraph in the book, that neither the 1867 Treaty of Cession, nor the 1884 Organic Act, nor any other federal statute had recognized Alaska Aboriginal title. And because of that non-recognition, there was no right to recompense. And remember, this was 4 years before the Court of Claims came out and said, yes, there is a right to recompense. But that court, 1959, would not have gotten where it would not have arrived where it did without the decision in Tehitan, which went on to say, Aboriginal title has not been extinguished. Well, if it hasn't been extinguished, it's still there. This was sort of like I said sometimes it was a silver lining, but it was a message that took a while to sink in because it was a powerful victory, but it didn't seem to be on the outside. At the outset, it seemed to be a defeat because there was going to be no money for the taking of the land. And I've read a lot of newspaper articles from when the Court of Claims made this decision in 1955. I can't remember what month, but the Chamber of Commerce trumpeted the victory. No money, land can be taken, no money. Just considered to be a huge victory for, development and progress and, really racist, really the white society is ascendant here, native land can be taken, no recompense. But it didn't take very long before it became clear that there was Aboriginal title. It hadn't been what they're calling recognized, but it wasn't nothing. And I can tell you there were so many people at this time who thought it was nothing. They were telling Native people, you don't own the land in any way. We took it fair and square. You're citizens now. Get with the program. Get with the program. And so when it sort of sank in that Aboriginal title really existed, that's what the Tlingit and Haida Court of Claims land suit in 1959 pegged its decision on the William Paul defeat, what looked like a defeat that actually had a hidden victory in it, so that it existed. It had not been extinguished. So the point is that in order to extinguish it, if you're going to settle it, you have to pay money then. So I was thinking last night about the internal consistency of these cases. Can I stand up here and tell you that these cases are internally consistent? And in many ways they're not. But what I'm trying to tell you is how the American judicial system responded, so you'll understand and know. To me, the takeaway message that I hope that you get is that this organization, this brave and visionary organization, was able to prevent the extinguishment of these rights through both the sword of these cases and also the shield of the congressional action, which is a whole nother talk. But I think I'm to the end. Wait, I just wrote one page of notes as I was coming up here. I just also wanted to say it's been a pleasure to have been consulted to assist Ishmael Hope and Perseverance Theater with the play that Ishmael is writing about William Paul and the others in the statehood, the others in this event, and it's called The Defenders of Alaska Native Country. And workshopping that for maybe 10 or 15 hours that we did permitted me to think through these two cases and how Ishmael is going to make Ben's grandpa here walk on the stage, or in some ways, he's got the football moves. So You know, you'll be hearing from Ben Paul in a minute about the quarterback. You've got William Paul, the quarterback, and he's throwing to daylight, and he's nimble, and he's learns from General Pratt and from Pop Warner. You know, you may hear about that. But in any event, thank you, Ishmael, for writing that, and to Ben for those for what you're going to be speaking. And then my last thought is just, and I believe Peter also would be very willing to come and talk to any group or class that you have to, if there are any students who are interested in learning more about this, we'd be very delighted to participate. And thank you so much for your attention.
Well, when I walked off the stage, I realized I took up more than twice the amount of time that I had planned on taking up at the mic. You know, I sort of seized the mic and didn't let it go. Consequence of that is that we're going to have Ben Paul come up, and there may not be time enough for Ishmael's presentation, and he's, you know, as he said, he'd take one for the team. But the fortunate part of what we've been doing here, and you may have seen us scurrying around trying to keep up with the video logging of this event, is that I can and will set it up for Ishmael to record his presentation, and we'll put it into this time slot that will be available on the web. There may be time after Ben gets done, but Ben Paul has traveled here from Seattle on his own dime, and he had recovered an audio recording of his grandfather, William Paul, and it's something that, you know, I just like the idea from the beginning. William Paul speaks, and it's an opportunity for us to hear the voice of this person who we've been talking about and studying, and through the presentation by his grandson, Ben Paul of Seattle. Thank you, Ben. Let me get this up first. Is Roxy here? Okay.
So we're going to here, is that right? The very last slide?
No, the first one.
The first one, okay.
And just click on it, Ben, to advance it. Click on it. Right there. That'll advance it. Okay.
I was looking at this photo and wondering. I was wondering what grandfather was thinking about. He's there holding his Teton raven hat. He's thinking about putting it into the Juneau Museum. Should I or shouldn't I? Well, it was already in there. He put it there to keep it safe. I think that maybe he thought into the future and said, nah, I know I don't really own the hat. It's the clan hat, and I'm the caretaker. But if they want to discuss it 40 or 50 years later, I'll let them work it out. And so even this last year, we have spent so much time working out who owns the hat, what does sacred mean, what kind of relationship do we want with the museum. And we worked it out. We talked it out, and we have our new caretaker here, Deborah O'Gara, Teton, and it's been good. It made us think so hard, grandfather. Some of you don't know me very well because I'm down in Seattle, so I'm going to just give you a short introduction. My name is Benjamin Starr Paul, Teton, Raven Clan, Kunaknusti, my Tlingit name. I get the Star with 2 R's from my mother's maiden name. She was a woman who grew up in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, and the great creator said, "Go out west," and she thought it was a good idea to marry a Tlingit man. William L. Paul Jr. Suhuk Ish, his Tlingit name. That name now belongs to my oldest son, Justin. The L in William L. Paul Jr.'s name stands for Lackey, which is his mother's maiden name. Before we listen to the recording, there are some transcripts that were supposed to have been handed out. If you don't have a transcript, raise your hand. I have a couple of helpers. The quality of the recording is pretty good, but this will help. And there's a couple of clarification notes in the transcript because William Paul was asked to give an account of his life in 15 minutes. So before we listen, I would like to tell you what was going on in the life of the Paul family around 1972 when this speech was given, just to let you know what was going on affecting him. There's 1969, one of my favorite photographs. That's me in the middle. And Grandma and Grandpa. And that's at our house. I think I just graduated from high school. I was happy. Basketball is the greatest game in the world. The sad thing is, though, that Grandma died about a year later, and I think they were married almost 60 years, and her Tlingit name, Keet Dak. She was adopted into the Nanya Ayi of Wrangell, and she was William L. Paul Sr.'s help and strength ever since they met at Whitworth College. Here's your first football picture there, Ishmael. Is that pointing to him? There he is, quarterback. And you can look up the full account of the famous Whitworth versus the University of Washington and University of Oregon story in their archives. It's quite a story that he loved to tell. Grandma and Grandpa were married on March 15th, 1911. There were some other problems in the Paul family, health problems. Fred Paul's wife, Aunt Gail, was battling liver cancer, and my own father, this is him in his King County courthouse office. He had just lost his job as King County prosecuting attorney due to the fact that he won a huge tax case against that airplane company down there. Oh yeah, Boeing. Mm-hmm. His boss was not reelected after 13 years, and William Paul Jr.'s name was on the blacklist, so he lost that job, and he lost his health after that, and in fact did die in 1974, which was a grievous thing for grandfather. Of course, in 1971, we all know what happened. But did we know that the Land Claims Act was not the victory that William Paul wanted, William Paul Sr., and he in fact did telegram President Nixon asking him to veto the bill. He wasn't done fighting yet. That's okay. I think we're ready to start the recording now. I'm not going to put up any more photos while it's going on.
Actually, we have to.
Oh. Not that one. No. We're just going to show this photo during the recording so that you can concentrate and follow along on a transcript.
You ready?
Whitworth College Alumni Association, Spokane, Washington. Dear Almighty, my class is 1909. In response to your request that I write a short history of my life since graduating, I find that I will have to include previous events for obvious reasons. Some people will consider that my narration is wrong, but believe you me that my life in Alaska has been so eventful that this story will indeed be short. For I have impressed my life and character on the now state of Alaska. I am 85 years of age, or will be on May 7th. And when my epitaph is written, it will include the following. 1. I integrated the public schools of Alaska. 2. I demonstrated by legal action the rights of the Indians and other natives to vote. 3. I got laws enacted that removed the words of discrimination in public assistance provisions for the mothers of destitute children. Also for direct relief for the aged poor. 4. I got the first appropriation from Congress for the direct relief of Indian destitution. 5. I promoted the advent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in order to get its Department of Medical Aid to stop the high mortality rate of infants. 6. I got Congress to extend the Indian Reorganization Act, IRA, to Alaska, by and through which over $20 million has been expended for Indian economy. The failure or partial failure of which was due to the communistic philosophy and paternalism of that department. 7. I was the leader in the legislative fight for equal rights, especially in public services, and thus ended segregation in restaurants, theaters, transportation, and schools. 8. I made the Alaska Native Brotherhood a powerful political organization by and through which many beneficial laws were enacted by candidates supported by the Indians. 9. I was a leader in securing schools for many Indian villages, Angoon, Hoona, Ketchikan, Yakutat, and others. 10. I wrote and introduced the bill that adopted the present state flag and inspired Marie Drake to write that most beautiful poem in the state song. There are many other things that I could mention, but you asked that my narration should be short. I have been able to supply the knowledge, the various skills, and the devotion necessary for some many things that have upped the material and spiritual welfare of my people, that I attribute the labyrinthic course of my life to the following. There is a great power called by various names by all people who has a purpose in creation And when he needs a man to implement this purpose, lo and behold, he or she is ready. Call it predestination or fatalism, if you wish. While I could look back in the pages of history for proof, it becomes more impressive and more wonderful when I take the proof of my own life. For all my plans have been set aside, and I am where I am, and sort of pushed into what I am about to relate. Within the span of my mother's life, 1863 to 1952, she was the first female elder of our church and is known as Tilly Paul, and in the service of our Presbyterian church for 70 years, widowed by the accidental death of my father, Louis, a lay preacher, who escaped the unwanted marriage after prayer to her unknown God, made her first prayer to this God in a commercial jargon Chinook, sheltered by a Methodist missionary, and returned to her home to find the A.R. McFarland Home for Girls. Everything that happened to her and to me seems like a miracle. Because of her, I was raised in the Presbyterian Sitka Training School and unknowingly became a Christian and made that fact known to the world when I was 16 years of age at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. At Sitka, I came under the influence of several wonderful men and women, and as I look back today, I see that they shaped my life. I didn't know it, but I was being led in preparation for which I regard as my life work, namely, a missionary in the field of law for a primitive people who did not need another preacher, but did need a lawyer. At Sitka, I became the bosom friend and playmate of a number of boys and girls with whom I was to be joined in the great Creator, by the great Creator in the work which is accredited to me when actually I was only the Aaron to their collective Moses. When I returned to them from Whitworth College and 10 years of business experience, they had reached the area of inquiry, knowing that things were wrong, but not what, and lacking a guide. Even in the matter of marriage, due to our Tlingit culture, the man had to be of the right clan, with its distinctive totem, namely a killer whale. He had to be opposite to her raven. Besides this, he had to be religious-minded and of the right caste. He was, and they were married, and were sent by the Presbyterian Church to the most warlike tribe of Tlingit Indians. And again, destiny had prepared him, for there was his tribesman, far removed from the southern branch at Cape Fox, known in history as 5440. There they began to work out preserving the Tlingit morality and culture, later to be incorporated by me in the preamble of the Constitution of the Alaska Native Brotherhood in these words: to oppose, to discourage, and to overcome the narrow injustice of race, to commemorate the fine qualities of the native races of North America, to preserve their history, lore, art, and virtues, to cultivate the morality, education, commerce, and civil government of Alaska, and a true respect for the Constitution of the United States, unquote. On my 14th birthday, I left my home in Sitka and said goodbye to my mother, whose illness had kept her there for 3 years, and I, with never a thought that I might never see her again, only looking forward to the great adventure at the famous Carlisle Indian School. And there I came under the influence one of the great men of his era, namely Richard Henry Pratt, who exchanged the confinement of the sullen Apaches at San Marco near St. Augustine, Florida, for the discipline of the school at the old Hessian Army Barracks of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he demonstrated that the Indian was, first of all, a human. There I learned it can be done. In school and the football field, I helped to demonstrate this as a member of Whitworth's greatest team of 1908, defeating, among others, the University of Oregon. I graduated in 1902 from this school and planned to enter Dickinson College Law School in the fall. But my mother got sick again, and I went home, and so gave up my chance of easy expense with a football scholarship. At Wrangell, I languished with no place to go except the current saloons, so I became a church worker. Due to a schism in our church, our membership got so low that the New York office gave orders to abandon it. But for two women, Mrs. Colonel Mason, formerly of Boston, who played the reed organ beautifully, and my mother, it would have been closed. I preached the sermons when we couldn't get someone else. Today, our entire denomination rejoices that Wrangell still has the first Protestant church in Alaska. During this time, I got to know the feel of the people, especially the Indians. While the Indians always believed that they owned the land from time immemorial, the whites of all descriptions, officials, prospectors, missionaries, and all others told the Indians that this is government land, till the Indians became bewildered, and so their lands were usurped by the squatters, and there was nobody to help us. I always knew that I would go to college, but how or when I didn't know. So when I applied for work and was asked, how long will you stay in my employment, I would answer, I plan to go to school, and there would go my job. It looked helpless because each year ended without a profit from commercial fishing and hand logging. I was proud of my physical strength, and I made even more muscle, which was to be useful later. In 1905, I agreed to go trapping with my stepfather. Just as we were about to start, I got into a violent altercation with my stepfather, William Tamry, and quit. Now I was without work, and there was none available during the winter. For want of something to do, I went into the attic of the manse for something to read, for ministers in Alaska never throw away magazines. There I found an old catalog, cover torn off, but the name was there, Whitworth College, Tacoma, Washington. I figured that I would enter next year, and so I wrote for a new catalog. In about 10 days, I got an answer from Dr. Bernard Cruzy, and it sounded as if he had been holding a room for me all this time, and that I should hurry and get down there. I dug around and rounded up about $125, and with that I started. My mother asked me, what are you going to do when you run out of money? To which I answered, oh, I will get a job, and when I have earned another $75, I will go back to school again. When I got to Whitworth, I discovered that if one is right there and on the job, doors open, and so it did for me. Sweeping, cutting grass at 25 cents an hour, milking cows. Expenses were low, too, and I got 50% discount on my room afforded the son of a missionary. My background in education was very spotty because Indian schools taught only English, history, and arithmetic. One teacher told us that mathematics was going out of style, and we could graduate even if we failed in algebra. And of course, we all did so. So my first algebra was college algebra, and I jumped right into the third book of Caesar and took on geometry 2 months late. I went to my classes and sat by myself, digging away to catch up. Besides, I promptly got on the football team and the basketball team and the baseball team, and helped edit the Whitworthian, helped to start a literary society, and later made the debating team with George Rossman, later Supreme Court Judge of Oregon, and became the leading man in the senior class play, Tennyson's Princess. In what time was left, I kept books for the college, and just for fun, I read 20.
And in what time that was left him, he had a sweetheart. And I wonder again, what is he thinking in that photograph? Thank you for listening.
How about giving Ben another round of applause? Last time I did a little introduction, I had my just fleece on, and it didn't seem like I had the kind of authority without having my ancestors on to give me authority to speak. We had been talking with the Sitka Tribe of Alaska a little bit and the Sea Alaska Corporation. They're in the middle of signing a document at the tribe that would work out an agreement of ownership on land and management of some of the land that Sea Alaska is getting. They're doing that today. I saw Albert Kukesh being on the Alaska Native Brotherhood Grand Camp Executive Committee is the reason why I wanted to recognize him, but then I talked with him, and I thought it'd be really appropriate to have them do the signing document here. It just would seem to bring some kind of significance because the Alaska Native Brotherhood, through some of the presentations, although they didn't identify some of the children that were spawned and grandchildren that were spawned of the A&B and ANS, the federally recognized tribes are children of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act was adopted by the United States Congress. And in the discussion that followed from that act through the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood, they had come to an agreement after a lengthy debate of should we be a reservation kind of Native people, or should we go through the Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA? Those who argued for the IRA won the argument of the day, went to Congress, and lo and behold, specifically because of the A&B's effort to the United States Congress, they amended the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 to include Alaska. Because of that effort, there are over 225 federally recognized tribes in Alaska now, one of which was the Sitka Community Association, now called the Sitka Tribe of Alaska. And as was identified by the presentation from Kathy of the 1929 A&B Grand Camp Convention in Haines, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA, was adopted in 1971, and what became of that? Sea Alaska Corporation. So it would be really appropriate during the presentations of the Clan Conference and talking about the A and B to have the children and grandchildren getting along, signing a document at the Clan Conference. We weren't able to do that because they had things set in motion, and I don't believe that they were able to adjust their schedule. So I think the A and B still is more nimble than ever before. But we're proud, as I'm president of the Alaska Native Brotherhood Sitka Camp Number 1, to see the children and grandchildren working together so well. With that in mind, we wanted to make sure that Ishmael got a chance to do a full presentation. So it's with great pride that I introduce my nephew, Ishmael Hope. Please give him a warm welcome.
All right. Well, Gunashchish, it's just a pleasure to listen to these colleagues. Listening and learning, whew, that's what this is about. It's not about having necessarily the opportunity to speak, though. The person I'm going to talk about is someone that I think learning his story can serve all of us. So I appreciate having the opportunity to share. Gunashchish, Uncle Jerry. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Kathy. And thank you, Ben, for your presentation as well. William Paul Sr. was, in many ways, a master to my father as an apprentice. My father took a class at Sheldon Jackson that William Paul was teaching, and William Paul welcomed him in his home. And then my father, he identified William Paul as the inspiration for his work in all the crest book that he did called Sacred Forms, his clan map, just his study and his push towards learning the history. From being invited into William Paul's home and hearing stories, traditional stories to the modern history that we're studying. So in many ways, William Paul is the spiritual grandfather of this clan conference. So it's just very special to see that cycle happening. So Gunashchish, thank you so much for coming here, for supporting my father's vision to unite clan leaders, tradition bearers, students, teachers, and scholars in a forum for sharing our knowledge. It is also a deep privilege to be colleagues with the organizing committee for the Clan Conference. I am deeply grateful to be working with these dedicated leaders and teachers. I thank the Clan leaders for the special words of comfort and encouragement and for bringing out their treasured adu. I thank the Tlingit language speakers for taking us into the ancestral thought world with their words. I thank the many presenters who enrich us with research, knowledge, and wisdom. Thank you, too, to the many volunteers who have made this conference a success. And thanks to Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood for all their work that they're continuing. And finally, I wish to thank Bill Martin and Flora Huntington, relatives of the man that I'm going to be talking about, Frank Johnson, Richard and Nora Downhauer, and Uncle Jerry and Jerry Hope, Peter Metcalfe and Kathy Ruddy, and historian and archivist Zachary Jones at the Sea Alaska Heritage Archives for making this research possible. Frank Johnson, Takwati of the Suktinedi, was one of the monumental leaders of the Alaska Native Brotherhood, who was at the front lines for the two major efforts of the Brotherhood and the Sisterhood, that of civil rights for Alaska Natives and the pursuit of Aboriginal title, which culminated in the Clinton Haida settlement of $7.5 million in 1968, and which directly led to the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971, as Peter and Kathy Ruddy talked about. Takwati was also a master tradition bearer, a storehouse of the ancient wisdom. He did all of this with severe humility, a reserve and reticence which would have made his ancestors proud, adding to the honor of his clan and respect among the traditional leaders of Tlingit country. Because of this honor, because of his versatility as a traditional knowledge bearer, and also his mastery of the politics of the time, Frank Johnson embodied many Tlingit ideals of leadership, which must serve as an example for future generations hungry, desperate even, to live the way their ancestors did. It's up to us to recognize the man truly for who he was. He was a great man, among many great people of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood. And by knowing deeply the leaders who have gone before us and those who are among us, we will have exemplars that will help us meet all of the challenges we face today. Frank Johnson held many positions with the Alaska Native Brotherhood, including multiple terms as Grand President. He served for nearly 3 decades as the Secretary of the Tlingit and Haida Indians of Alaska, with my great-grandfather, Andrew Hope Sr., Ka'ushte of the Chak Kudihit of the Kagwantan. Both the Brotherhood and Tlingit and Haida were volunteer organizations. He fished like many of his contemporaries and was a school teacher. He also served in the Alaska Territorial Legislature from 1947 to 1957. Frank Johnson was a leader from one of the major civil rights protests of the Brotherhood and Sisterhood in 1930 and 1931, after he and Isaac Katass were kicked out of the Coliseum Theater. He wrote a letter to the A&B Grand President of the time, Louis Shotridge, Stuaka of the Kagwantan. Through the leadership of Frank and Louis, the Coliseum Theater threw open its doors to Alaska Native people, a major success in the fight for civil rights, which culminated in the passage of the Anti-Discrimination Act of 1945. Here is a story in Frank's words, recorded by Vesta Johnson in 1975. In 1930, I had a chance to go to Juneau. I'd heard about those signs in the windows of restaurants and hotels and other public places. When I got there, I actually saw those signs. It went something like this: "We do not cater to Native trade, no Indians allowed," and so on. We went into the Coliseum Theater, Isaac Katass of Klawock and myself. We started to walk into the main floor, and they stopped us. They said, "You can't go in there." "Why?" I asked. "We paid our fare, our admission." "Well, you can't." She just kept repeating it. It happened to be a young woman. "You can't go in there." So I demanded to see the manager. "He's not around now," she said. I said, "Well, you better give us back our admission price, and we're not staying here." She wanted to give us a ticket for a later show. I told them, "It's not that." I told her, "You're going to hear about this. If the manager were here, we'd talk to him. But you're going to hear about this." So Louis Shotridge of Kagwantan was a grand president. He had gone to the University of Pennsylvania, taking special courses. So I wrote a letter to him outlining what took place in Juneau. Then I took the position that we had a right to sit any place among our friends, preferably. But since we paid our own way, we should be accorded the right to sit any place we wanted to. So we used that as a basis for a boycott. The A&B and ANS boycotted Coliseum Theaters of Alaska. Of course, they kind of laughed it off. The larger towns caught the full impact of the action we had taken. Places like Ketchikan and Wrangell, Juneau and Sitka, Petersburg, and a few other places where the picture shows were controlled by Coliseum theaters. It lasted just about a month. And the chain of picture shows noticed that they had began to take terrific losses in attendance. It wasn't just our people, but people that were sympathetic and would not stand the terrible feeling of discriminatory treatment in public places. At the end of the month, the manager of the picture shows decided to defer, and they threw it open to everybody. And they did it in a nice way. Once they decided to give in, they invited our people free admission in all those places as a peace movement. So they're the ones that ended the action that had been taken by the ANB and ANS. From that time, we had no more trouble getting into public places. But some of the feeling persisted. Mrs. Roy Peradovich, a bill was introduced, as I understand, sometime around 1947. This preceded us over there. People said that you can't legislate that feeling out of existence. And her argument was that by that stand, you should not have any law against murdering. You can't stop someone from murdering if they really want to commit murder. But nevertheless, such laws are on the books so that they wouldn't go too far. That's her argument. So she won. And by that law against discrimination, it went on the law books. Frank left out the part about being elected Grand President the year after as a result of his heroic efforts. He didn't go out of his way to tell of his accomplishments. As you hopefully witnessed at this conference with the tradition bearers and clan leaders, such as Alan Zuboff's powerful exhortation that for clan leaders being a spokesperson is not for self-gratification, but for the a'u, the clan hat that the leader represents. This is a Tlingit ideal. It's up to us to see him for what he was, to know and to cherish what he did for us. Frank was also a leader in the other major efforts of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood. In addition to civil rights, the pursuit of Aboriginal title. He served with Andrew Hope to successfully sue the United States government for the stealing of our land. It started this way. As Fred Paul told it, in 1925, Peter Simpson asked William Paul, who owned this land? William paused and said, well, we do. Then fight for it. And that's what got it started. William Paul was close to Judge James Wickersham, Alaska's territorial delegate, who provided the legal framework for the fight for the land, which was to petition the U.S. Congress for a Jurisdiction Act, which, if passed, would allow the Tlingit and Haida Indians to seek a settlement in the Court of Claims. And William Paul and his sons, Bill Jr. and Fred, also sued the government on behalf of the Teton clan, as Peter and Kathy Ruddy had talked about. Though the case lost in the U.S. Supreme Court, the wording of that court's decision opened up a world of opportunity for the Tlingit and Haida efforts. And after that, the statewide efforts. Frank Johnson and Andrew Hope carried the Tlingit and Haida case to success. Now we have politically and economically powerful organizations, tribes, and corporations because of the efforts of people like Frank. They were never paid for the decades of work. They just did it because they were leaders. Noah Downhour recently told me that Frank was able to do all this because he was excellent at English. Now, this is astounding to me because he was also a masterful storyteller in the Tlingit language. His telling of Duktut, the strongman story, beautifully edited by Richard and Nora in Hashuka, are stories. is an essential contribution to the world's indigenous oral literature. Frank didn't tell you how to be humble, how to persevere with inner strength, how to be a leader in the Tlingit tradition. He just lived it. And he told stories that wrapped close listeners in the ancestral spirit with its beautiful, beautiful values and wisdom. Toward the end of his life, Frank also wrote many booklets on Tlingit knowledge for the Ketchikan Indian Corporation's Johnson O'Malley program. Here's a passage on the training of young men from Tlingit Family Life, published in 1980. In the winter, when the first chill of the northern winds could be felt, the boys and the men went to the sea to plunge in and to walk into the seawater. The older and the more respected leaders had branches tied into a bunch, and the young men were beaten on their chests. To cry was a disgrace. It was permissible only to say, "Whew, whew." After a few minutes, the second in line roughly shoved the first out of the way. "I am ready," he would say. If a boy wanted to be a leader someday, he might even say, "Hit me in the face." He was preparing for the great strength and tolerance he would need as a great man. This kind of physical training was geared to age levels. Young teenage boys would be thrown in by the maternal uncles or older brothers and allowed to go warm up in a few minutes. The principal reasons for this customs were it made men physically strong, and physical fitness was an important requirement to make a living. It made men strong-willed and not easily discouraged. It gave men confidence to tackle difficult tasks, and it kept men from indulging in vain and empty boasts. And alone, a strong body does not make a leader. It was and still is the development of a keen mind that makes a great man. In the old days, the more respected elders with intimate knowledge of clan history and legends told the young people the stories and would test them often. The boys who listened carefully were closely watched. Those that did not come or listen or failed to remember were also noted. The lecturers were sometimes rough on their students. Some boys would leave disgusted or insulted. Those boys were ignored, and no one forced them to come back. They were just not sharp enough. The Tlingit legends were taught to boys for the same reason Greek myths are studied by American college students. Wisdom, or the lack of it, is made clear in these stories. Frank Johnson's contributions were profound, but it was uncommon with the many great leaders of Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood. Much was accomplished in the face of terrible racism and deep cultural suppression. They won citizenship, they won the right to vote, they won civil rights, they won integration in schools, and they won a settlement with the United States government for this land, our land. And many of them were Anyatki, noble people, clan leaders, tradition bearers, and speakers of Tlingit language. Now, Stephen Haycox, he gave an excellent talk yesterday about the acculturation of the Brotherhood and Sisterhood. Professor Haycox's writings on William Paul and the A&B and A&S, I believe, belong in every school in Alaska. However, I'd like to add a term that might help to clarify the contributions of our leaders. I think the leaders of the A&B and A&S were and are exemplars of multiculturation. They enriched every culture they participated in. More often than not, the Tlingit traditional thought world, with progressive politics or not, was at the center of their lives. Carol Brady, the Natla of the Nanya Aayi, and child of Kix Adi, she grew up in Sitka. Now in her 80s, she tells me that she attended the Pu'ik, the memorial ceremony, when she was very young. These were held in homes in the village part of Sitka. My great-auntie Ellen Hope Hayes recently told me that the Ku'ik was held in homes and not the A&B Hall because of the A&B's fundraising efforts. They were fighting for their lives. They needed to pay for lawyers, travel to Washington, D.C., and to fund the general business of the Brotherhood and Sisterhood. This suggests to me that the Ku'ik never died, never needed to be completely resurrected because it was never completely gone. And so the leaders of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood were protectors of the Tlingit tradition as much as or more than they were cultural suppressors. That's what the historical record and the oral history will tell you. Charlie Joseph Kath'ut of the Kagwantan said during the 1980 Elders Conference organized by Sea Alaska, Alaska Native Brotherhood the spirit helpers of my grandfathers already joined with the Alaska Native Brotherhood. The ancestors and the spirits of our clans are at the center of the Tlingit world. Here, Charlie Joseph, a major tradition bearer, made a powerful statement which perfectly clarifies how to view the efforts of organizations such as the A&B and the ANS. There is no either or. It's both. My grandfather, John Hope, constantly reminded people that the A&B and the ANS were tools we use to fight for our people. But a political tool is not a means of identity unless we let it happen. That's why we have to speak our languages, live through the clan, understand our history, and spend time with the older people just as our elders and ancestors have done. Let's keep the fire crowded when the tradition bearers are telling stories. In Frank's telling of the strongman story, the people were paddling towards Sea Lion Rock to meet with the giant sea lion. Duktut, who had secretly trained for strength, sat in the back of the boat as a bailer. Now there's this wonderful proverb that Frank Johnson talked about in relation to this part when he's back there as the bailer. It's and so he just went as a bailer. That's what Frank Johnson did. He just quietly did his work. It's up to us to know and to recognize and to cherish what he did for us. He was, like many of his peers, a true Tlingit leader. Gunichish, thank you so much.
One of the greatest compliments I can give a young fellow like Ishmael is he does his father proud. We're going to take a about 15-minute break, get back together here at about 45.